be coming from inside the house. Since the war began, Russian military recruiting officers have had a bad habit of spontaneously catching fire. As the war dragged on, it was now warehouses, shopping malls, railroad tracks, and even fuel facilities that were now going up in flames or exploding. Without a doubt, a number of these have been the work of Ukrainian sabotage operatives,
Greetings, friend.
as they followed almost
We
to
will
the letter
speak
old
together
Soviet sabotage
whatever you
doctrine
wish,
that
but
would have been
bring
put into
words that
effect in
can
case of a
warm.
war against NATO. Russia has apparently forgotten that Ukraine was once part of the Soviet Union,
Are you
and
brave
while
or
it forgot its
foolish,
Cold War
or
training,
just
Ukraine
mad?
apparently did
Well,
not.
speak.
However,
I
a
will
growing
listen
Russian
before I
resistance
turn you
movement
inside.
has been gaining steam, even as hundreds of thousands of men are drafted and sent to war. On January 3rd and 4th, partisan attacks on railroads halted the movement of men and supplies along the Trans-Siberian Rail Network, all going to Ukraine. This would be the sixth case in just the first few days of the new year of partisan activity. In the prior year, multiple locomotives were destroyed and there were 40 confirmed cases of sabotage of Russian rail infrastructure. The fact that this activity increased significantly after the announcement of Putin's partial mobilization implies heavily that this is a true Russian partisan movement and not more Ukrainian sabotage. Currently, the resistance movement is tiny, but the number of attacks seem to be increasing over time. This could turn into a massive headache for Putin, especially as many now state that Russia cannot win in Ukraine without a full mobilization. But Putin has likely taken the temperature inside of Russia itself and knows that a general mobilization could be the final straw that breaks the camel's back. Russians love themselves a good old dictator, but Putin broke the social contract upheld in Russia for decades. You can be the dictator all you want to be, as long as you don't actively make life worse for Russian citizens. A Russian soldier already battle-hardened has just heard that back home, quite a few of the local shops in his town have closed down. Russia's economy is collapsing. He thinks of the men who've already lost their lives, men who'd become his friends. At night, he sleeps on crates of grenades, and during the day, he takes orders from idiots. He's had enough. He's leaving this damn war, but the decision will haunt him forever. This is a true story that mirrors many Russian soldiers' experiences in their war with Ukraine. This guy's war did not get off to a good start. The first days...
Savor summer's favorite memories with Wawa's pulled pork sandwich. Gotta have a Wawa.
were like something out of a horror movie. He described driving a Kamaz truck in a convoy heading in the direction of Kherson, and the closer he got, he started to see dumped Russian equipment more and more frequently. Scattered in the streets and laying in the mud were dry rations,
The needs
just left
of
there,
my people
like
are
Insidious
simple.
omens sprouting from the
Some of
chewed-up
you-
ground. As his truck passed through a village, a Ukrainian man, his eyes filled with tears and his voice infused with a maniacal hatred, ran up to the convoy and screamed, "You are all bleeped." The Russian soldier later said, "He almost climbed into the cabin where we were. His eyes were teary from crying. It made a strong impression on me." Of course it did. Like many of his comrades, he was not sure that fighting this war was a good idea. He didn't buy into what his government was telling him. When he saw those locals, he wondered how he'd feel if Ukrainian troops were doing the same in his town. At times, he felt great shame for what he was doing. Many of the men did, and many of them couldn't tell you precisely what they were fighting for. It didn't help
Are you
morale that there
brave
was
or
never enough
foolish,
water to
or
drink.
just
Their
mad?
equipment was often broken. They were still waiting for the combat bonuses they've been promised. Then, from time to time, he hears news from back home that more shops in the cities and towns were closing down due to a failing economy. The war was impoverishing people, and for what exactly? We'll come back to this guy's story soon, but first, you'll need to hear some more reasons why soldiers have been leaving the Russian army in droves. A corporal named Ilya Kaminsky said he was fighting with the 11th Separate Air Assault Brigade when he and many of his comrades decided it was time to pack in the war. They'd only been fighting for 4.5 months. 4.5 months, too much. He said later in an interview, "I'm morally exhausted. There's absolutely no trust in the authorities and the higher command from the very first word." In his short time in the war, he'd seen his brigade of about 1,000 men take serious damage. Around 500 men had been injured or killed in those first few months. He said that no one felt safe, not for a minute. That's not surprising in a war, but some of the men believed the orders they were being given were not rational at times. They felt like cannon fodder. It seemed like the blind were leading the blind. This young guy and 70-plus men in his brigade wanted a fast exit out of the war before they became the proverbial lambs to slaughter. Many of them had written letters to their superiors asking for reassignment. Their officer said that's not going to happen. What's more, they were threatened with insubordination charges. Just like the first guy we talked about, they realized the only way out of this war was to embrace what you might call drastic measures. Their pleading letters were obviously falling on deaf ears. Nonetheless, just packing up their stuff and leaving was not exactly easy. Let's just remember how seriously militaries take desertion or going absent without leave. The two terms are similar, the main difference being that a soldier might only be called a deserter if he's been absent without leave for a certain amount of time. A soldier could, in theory, go missing, but that might not mean he's deserted. Once someone has deserted, though, that historically means trouble and shame for the family, and much worse for the transgressor. The first thing the military has been doing in Russia is trying to convince men that deserting is an inglorious act, and only the lowest of the low do it. You might know from some of our other shows that some of the guys called up in this war have only received perhaps 2 or 3 weeks of training. It's not much, but it's enough to learn that desertion is a mighty shameful thing to do. They have this drilled into them before they go to the front lines. For instance, in the Russian town of Buyanovsk, which serves as the home base for the 205th Cossack Motorized Rifle Brigade, Russian commanders have put up what they call a wall of shame. We can't say exactly what this wall looks like right now, but back in July, reports stated there were 300 men mentioned on the wall. Next to their photo was their full name, rank, and a passage about them disobeying orders. This translated as, they forgot their military oaths, the ceremonial promise, their vows of duty to their fatherland. This kind of thing can be powerful, where competitive masculinity is concerned. If you're fighting with a bunch of guys, the last thing you want to be called is a coward or a chicken. For some men, bravery becomes a kind of peeing contest. They might not even care about the reasons they're supposedly fighting for. They care more about the other soldiers saying how tough and brave they are. Problem is, once you're dead, you're not around to bask in the compliments. You won't be missed when you're gone, not by the people who put up that wall of shame at least. One of the soldiers whose name was on that board said as much. He knew what he'd done would not exactly lead to praise, but he didn't care. His continued existence was more important than looking like one of the tough guys. He later said in an interview, "I understand everything, of course. I signed a contract. I'm supposed to be ready for any situation, this war, this special operation. But I was thinking, I'm still young. At any moment, a piece of shrapnel, a bullet could fly into my head." He just opted out. He decided he didn't want to fight. He explained, "I thought a long time about it and came to the decision. I understood that I had to refuse so I could stay alive. I don't regret it one bit." Maybe some of you are now thinking that what he did was disgraceful. After all, he'd signed up without any coercion. That is true, but this guy said also that he and others weren't even given helmets or flak jackets. They didn't have standard munitions, and there wasn't even enough food and water for them. Other men came forward and said the same things. Some of them said that the commanders had very little regard for what happened to the troops. They said all they cared about was not giving up their positions. One of them said, "They just don't care. You're a soldier for them. You're nobody." As we said, this is not that unusual in Ukraine right now. Remember that guy we talked about at the start that slept on a bed of grenades? He was a junior officer. He said when he thought about giving up the fight, many of the men around him, the professionals and the conscripts, were thinking the same thing. He later talked to the press, but not surprisingly didn't want to give up his name. In an interview, he said, "We were dirty and tired. People around us were dying. I didn't want to feel like I was part of it, but I was part of it." When he joined the war, he knew something was wrong at the start when his superiors took away all the men's phones. They were then told they'd be heading to Ukraine, but weren't told what they'd be doing or why they'd be doing it. He said that they weren't even brainwashed with the denazification propaganda that Putin had talked about. They knew absolutely nothing about why they were fighting, other than what they'd heard in the past about the Ukraine situation. As you know, those first few days in Ukraine were strange for him and others in his convoy. With all that Russian equipment everywhere and local villagers running out of their houses and screaming at them, it was a tense time indeed, especially when some of those villagers pulled out weapons and started firing at them. He said for the first week he was in a state of shock, adding, "I just went to bed thinking, today is March 1st, tomorrow I will wake up, it will be March 2nd. The main thing is to live another day." Several times the shells fell very close. It's a miracle none of us died. But then, men started dying, sometimes after what seemed like counterintuitive orders. Each day he felt guilty about invading another country. And then, when he heard that the Russian economy was in trouble, he just wanted to leave. He saw no point in fighting anymore. Fighting for what? For whom, exactly? Nothing made sense. He soon became just another contender for the wall of shame. He didn't care. One night he was lying in bed and he just thought, "Damn it, tomorrow I'm going to write a letter and hand it over to my commander. I'll say I'm resigning immediately." This was not the same as going AWOL. It was a resignation, but the problem is that militaries tend to not accept such resignations, not now or ever. Can you imagine a British soldier writing such a letter of resignation during World War I? "Dear Field Marshal Haig, I'm having a tough time, old boy. I do hate these blasted trenches. This war is absolutely beastly, and so I hereby resign forthwith. Please accept it, or I am liable to discover it." You couldn't do that then, and you really can't do it now. That's why soldiers go AWOL and desert. If a soldier is deployed on an active mission, he has a contractual obligation to fulfill. You are committed to a contract, and that commitment is very important, because if you leave, what's to stop a bunch of others from leaving, putting the lives of other soldiers at risk? This is why enlistment contracts make it really hard to just skip out of combat. Still, This Russian guy tried. His commander said, fair enough, but what you're doing is a criminal act. You're betraying your nation. He said there will be hell to pay, but he didn't regress back to the days of Stalin and just unloaded his gun into the guy's head. A woman named Valentina Melnikova, the executive secretary of the Union of Soldiers' Mothers Committees of Russia, said that such instances have happened repeatedly in Ukraine. Young soldiers are now saying they want to resign because they either have moral concerns about what they're doing or they're no longer psychologically able to fight. Thanks to the work of Melnikova's foundation, these men are aware they can legally say this, but
does it make sense that these New skeletons are more jazzy than scary? No. But neither does Popeye's ghost pepper wings that are more flavor than fire. Both are scary good. We don't make sense. We make chicken.
they will still, no doubt, be threatened with legal action or face a varying number of other types of intimidation. This is not the 1940s. Millennials and Gen Zs are a different breed of human from guys back then. You could say that the days of nobly dying on the battlefield are past us. When the going gets tough, the young of today sometimes get going in the opposite direction. Who could blame them when they hardly know what they're fighting for and are often not adequately equipped to fight a war? Many, it seems, do not care about being noble. Being noble is no help to anyone when you're dead and you can't look after your family. UK intelligence said not long ago that it received numerous reports of Russian soldiers just refusing to fight. The agency wrote, "We've seen Russian soldiers, short of weapons and morale, refusing to carry out orders, sabotaging their own equipment. Such anarchy among the ranks is certainly taking things a step further, but there are plenty of reports of men asking to resign or at least be reassigned, only for their letters to be ripped to shreds. Some were told to rescind their requests and they might be given a cushy job somewhere else, but it seems in general the letters don't work at all. Their only option is to refuse to take any more orders. And that's why a number of Russian soldiers have already been arrested. There are reports of unit commanders gathering up troops unwilling to fight and sending them to a prison in the Luhansk region. Now their photos are on a wall of shame somewhere, and some reports say they're being given just one meal daily. One report said, as of July 20th, the fate of detained soldiers was unknown. Even so, imprisoning these guys might well be against the law. In Russian military law, a person cannot legally desert. Still, if he stays in his unit and refuses to fight while saying he rejects his orders on moral grounds, maybe he's suddenly become a pacifist. He's not committed a crime. In some cases, the soldiers tried to resign, but if that was unsuccessful, they refused to fight. As long as they made it clear they were refusing on moral grounds and not just because they couldn't be bothered to fight or said it was too dangerous, this should have been okay. As you know, a bunch of them were sent to prison, so it seems that this exclusion no longer applies. An expert on this matter explained, he's not refusing to carry out orders, so the article on insubordination or disobeying orders isn't relevant either, because he's not refusing to do so, he simply declares that he has anti-war convictions. It seems that quite a lot of Russian soldiers had the help of activists before they pulled the pacifist card on their superiors. Others have arranged sham marriages to get out of service, and there have been reports of some soldiers shooting themselves in the leg and hoping to claim compensation, as well as a get-out-of-Ukraine-free card. In a phone call that was intercepted by Ukrainian intelligence, a Russian soldier told his mother that he had enough. "This won't end anytime soon," he said. "What the hell do I need this for? At 20 years old, I'm not at all interested in Ukraine." His mother said, "That didn't sound very patriotic," to which he replied, "I had a commander who shot himself in the leg just to get out of here, and that was in the very beginning. What is there to talk about?" Interestingly, he told her that only about 50% of his brigade was still there. Sure, some had been killed and some had been taken prisoner, but he believes some had just gone missing, vanished into thin air. "Our people are just disappearing on their own," he said. This has not gone down very well with Vladimir Putin. In September, just as Russia threw another 300,000 reservists into the war, Putin signed a decree that stated a soldier could get 10 years in prison for surrendering, deserting, or refusing to fight. Putin must have been desperate because he also signed a decree that made it far easier for foreigners to get Russian citizenship if they joined the Russian armed forces. This might well be enticing for people who live in the poorer countries close to Russia. As for soldiers who don't try to play the pacifist card and do just run away, they will very likely be hit with that 10-year sentence if they're caught. The best thing they can do is try to get to another country where they could try and claim asylum as refugees, but it seems that that would not be easy at all. Countries may not take them, just as some nations don't want any Russian refugees. Gabrielius Landsbergis, the Minister of Foreign Affairs for Lithuania, has said as much. He stated Lithuania will not be granting asylum to those who are simply running from responsibility. Russians should stay and fight. Against who? Claiming asylum is never not complicated. If Russian soldiers try to do this, the country looking at taking them will have to consider what they did in the war and what kind of persecution they'll face in Russia. The country would also have to think about national security concerns regarding taking in Russian soldiers. So imagine, you're a young Russian man and you're really against war. You are then conscripted even though you have a job, a wife, and some children. That's happened many times already. You're against fighting and you don't want to kill any Ukrainians. But if you refuse to fight once you're there, you're looking at shame and bullying and a good chunk of your life behind bars. Moreover, no one will want to take you if you try to escape to another country. An expression the British might use in this situation is you'd be navigating Poop Creek without the benefit of having a paddle. Hiding in Ukraine would not be easy. Even if a soldier had family there, they'd likely just be picked up and taken as a prisoner of war. This recently happened to a few Russian soldiers, and they were asked to speak on video. But let's remember, they had guns at their backs. Still, you have to ask if what they said had any truth to it. One man explained to the camera, frankly speaking, they tricked us. Everything we were told was fake. Don't tell my guys to leave Ukrainian territory. We've got families and children. I think 90% of us would agree to go home. It's hard to say that if he meant that, seeing as his life was in danger. As we make this video, there are reports of captured Russian soldiers being executed by Ukrainian forces. A war crime no less, adding to the war crimes already committed by both sides. It looks like most of them were shot in the head, say forensic experts. There are pools of blood that indicates that they were just left there dead. There appears to have been no effort to pick them up or help them. The Russian government was furious, accusing the Ukrainian soldiers of mercilessly shooting unarmed Russian POWs. Ukraine fired back, saying the Russian soldiers had opened fire on Ukrainian soldiers. They were only pretending to surrender, said Ukraine, and that's why they're all dead now. The New York Times has tried to analyze what video evidence does exist, but with bits cut out, it's not so easy. The United Nations has asked for an investigation into the matter, which will try to ascertain if Ukrainian soldiers have every right to fire back and kill those men, or if the Russians were slaughtered. It might turn out that no war crime was committed, but if it goes the other way, it doesn't bode well for any Russian soldiers who might want to surrender. It's not always easy to know what happens during wars, since both sides employ mountains of lies and propaganda. You'll know that if you've ever been a good student of history like we are at the infographic show. Current media narratives very rarely mirror what we've been told about wars 10 or 20 or 30 years down the line. With that being said, surrendering for Russian soldiers could go okay, but we just don't know. It might also go the opposite of okay. It's not surprising then that some Russian soldiers are more than willing to say bad things about their fatherland. Their life might depend on it. No doubt, there have been a lot of war crimes committed in this war that we know nothing about. Crimes committed by both sides. This is important to understand today because we have to ask what a Russian soldier would do if he wanted to desert when already inside Ukraine. We're not so sure that if he went over to the other side and said, hey guys, sorry about that, my bad, that he'd get much support. Going AWOL in Ukraine for a Russian soldier might be akin to a family of sheep going on vacation to the Serengeti National Park, looking for a place to stay at the Lion's Den Hotel. Ukraine has also complained that its own soldiers taken as POWs have been beaten and tortured, with some reports stating that some were executed on the spot, another war crime. This is not what's supposed to happen under the Geneva Conventions Act. Some have been taken as POWs, and at times some have been released in prisoner swaps. There are reports that have come back from the UN investigators that have said POWs from both sides have faced hell. UN investigators have said some Ukrainian POWs said they suffered prolonged beatings, were put in stress positions, and even faced dog attacks. The same investigators said Russian POWs complained of being punched and kicked, and others said they were stabbed or given electroshocks. Very few POWs have spoken directly with the press, so all the information in these reports was gathered through official investigators. Nonetheless, The Guardian spoke with a former Russian POW named Anton. He said he thought the war was absurd but ended up fighting in it anyway. At one point he was captured. A bag was put over his head and he was taken into captivity. He said, "You shake at the smallest of noises. Every day you hope that this won't be your last and you'll not be killed." He said he wasn't beaten, though he explained, "We were constantly told that Russia is finished, that we belong to the bottom of society."
Those empty calories just leave you feeling empty. This summer, treat yourself to the Extreme Watermelon Smoothie, made with a watermelon juice blend, coconut water, and sweetened strawberries. Only at Smoothie King.
They would threaten to starve us. During my captivity, I blocked most of my emotions. I just tried not to think about my life. So how is life for a POW? We just can't say, but it seems it's never a walk in the park. As for the worst things that have happened, maybe the UN will tell us in the future. As The Conversation wrote, treatments of POWs by Ukraine and Russia is breaking international rules. That's both sides doing what they shouldn't be doing under international law. But for the sake of today's show, we very much doubt a Russian soldier can put his hands up and tell the other side, it's all been a big mistake. and he can settle down somewhere in Ukraine where the Russian government won't find him. If he tried that, he'd likely be captured, possibly beaten, and then sent back to Russia at some point to face the music there. The music in this case would be an interrogation that might end with a 10-year prison sentence. We can't say how many Russian soldiers have been killed since fighting broke out. The estimates differ wildly depending on which source you're looking at. Some reports say about 18,600 Russian soldiers have been killed since February 2022, although only about half of that number has been confirmed. Thousands more from both sides have been taken as prisoners of war. On top of that, hundreds of thousands of Russians have fled their homeland since the war began, although many of those people, even though they're against the war, have been met with a lot of anti-Russian sentiment in their chosen new home. It's hard to say how many people involved in the Russian exodus were people who might have gotten the call to enlist, but we imagine that number is quite high. For those who were too late and actually ended up on the front lines, some have been found wandering around Ukraine dirty and hungry, not knowing where to go. They're now persona non grata on both sides of the border. As with all wars, a certain number of folks have gone missing, which is likely not the best of fates as it so often means they're dead. There is no such thing as a positive outcome for a Russian soldier who doesn't want to fight. But as things stand, he'd probably fare better claiming to be a pacifist than he would be trying to disappear in Ukraine or the wilds of Russia. It's the deadliest ship on the seven seas, especially if you're serving aboard. Well, pretty much only if you're serving aboard it. It's the Admiral Kuznetsov, and it's the absolute worst ship to ever sail under the Russian flag. Admiral Flota Sovietskого Soyuza Kuznetsov, or in English, ship which barely works, was designed during the late Cold War. The Soviet Union had a historical disadvantage when it came to naval warfare, largely spurred on by its lack of access to warm water ports. This makes fielding a large maritime force difficult. But Russia's immediate proximity to large European powers also means that throughout its history, its army has been prioritized over all other services. Yet navies allow one to project power globally. And without one, it doesn't matter how big your army or air force is. You'll only ever be a regional power. Without a navy, you can't hold enemy economic interests at threat unless they are a landlocked power, and resupplying your own troops becomes difficult. Protecting your own economic interests is also practically impossible, especially if you're heavily dependent on sea trade. This is the driving force behind China's massive naval buildup in the Pacific. The Soviet Union didn't completely axe its navy, but it knew that it couldn't compete with NATO, or mainly the US Navy. America has historically been the opposite of Russia, with two big oceans on either coast. The US has by necessity been a naval power. By the early 20th century, the US Navy was muscling in on the Royal Navy in terms of tonnage and capability. By the end of the Second World War, the US Navy reigned supreme, and would remain that way until China would rise to threaten it. And even then, China only presents a regional threat to the US Navy, not a global one. In the Cold War, the Soviet Union had two maritime goals in case of a war. First, to delay and disrupt US shipping to Europe, and the second, to defend its own shores and keep the US Navy from joining the fight. With a naval air force larger than most national air forces, the Soviet Union was in effect facing two American air forces. To achieve the first goal, the Soviets had to break the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap, a stretch of ocean that runs between the three countries. Getting a surface action group past this defensive line was a dicey proposition at best, if not completely impossible outside of World War III historical fantasy books. However, the Soviets did have the capability of launching an amphibious assault against Iceland, linchpin of the Atlantic defensive line, albeit only if it could take NATO by surprise and move swiftly. Breaking the Atlantic line was vital for the Soviets keeping U.S. firepower out of Europe. With a wall of NATO nations between it and the ports used to offload American troops and equipment in Europe, the Soviets could only hope to interdict American shipping across the Atlantic trade routes, much like the Germans attempted to do. Exactly like the Germans, the Soviets relied primarily on submarines to accomplish this task and fielded a very large and capable submarine force for just a task. This left the Soviet surface fleet with the mission of defending Eastern Bloc shorelines from the U.S. Navy, a role they would be far more survivable in. Operating close to shore in a fortress fleet doctrine, Soviet ships enjoyed the protection of shore-based air defenses and anti-ship missiles. However, the Soviets still wanted the capability to project power far from home in low-intensity conflicts, where they wouldn't have to face far more sophisticated naval forces. And there was the prestige of owning aircraft carriers, America's crown jewel. Thus, the Admiral Kuznetsov class was designed from the ground up for a fundamentally different role than that of the American carrier fleet. Until the Kuznetsov class, the Soviets never had true aircraft carriers, instead operating cruisers that could house small air wings. At first, this was only a small helicopter complement to aid in scouting and anti-submarine warfare. But in the 1970s, the Soviets laid down the Kiev class, a hybrid cruiser and fixed-wing aircraft carrier. Originally, the Soviet Admiralty wanted to develop a comparable supercarrier to the American Kitty Hawk class. However, budget realities soon set in, and the survivability of these massive platforms against the might of the U.S. Navy was put into question. Thus, a compromise was reached, resulting in what the Soviets would call a heavy aviation cruiser. This fancy bit of wordplay, which should be familiar to Japanese audiences, was actually a pretty fair description, but also necessary so that the Soviet Kiev class could exit the Turkish Straits. Under the 1936 Montreux Convention regarding the regime of the Straits, warships transiting the Turkish Straits between the Mediterranean and Black Sea were limited to a certain size, tonnage, and weaponry. Aircraft carriers over 15,000 tons were forbidden from crossing the straits, and this was a problem for the Soviet Union, as it built all of its aircraft-carrying cruisers in present-day Ukraine. While aircraft carriers over 15,000 tons were forbidden from crossing, aircraft-carrying warships were not, as at the signing of the treaty, many battleships carried a small complement of aircraft for spotting fire and reconnaissance. Thus, the Soviets simply called their ships aircraft-carrying cruisers. And all was well, despite the complement of up to 12 Yak-38 VTOL aircraft. To be fair, the Kiev class was also packing significant firepower aside from its aircraft. Its foredeck was littered with air defense and surface attack missiles, as well as 10 torpedo tubes. The ships could pack P-500 anti-ship missiles, up to 8 in total, and sporting a fearsome 2,200-pound warhead, or alternatively a 350-kiloton nuclear warhead. Flying at Mach 3, these missiles haunted the dreams of U.S. sailors and were surprisingly sophisticated for the time. Fired in salvos, the missiles would fly at wave-top height, with one missile flying at higher elevation and using its radar to feed targeting data to the other missiles. If that missile was destroyed, another missile would automatically take its place. Upon reaching the final phase of their flight, all of the missiles would pop up and turn on their radars, with half the salvo homing in on big U.S. carriers and the rest on its escort ships. Only 3 of the Kiev class would be built, with one becoming a Chinese luxury hotel in 2014, another turned into a naval museum in 2016, and the third broken up and sold for scrap. A subclass of the ships known as the Baku subclass would result in one ship, the Admiral Gorshko.
Introducing Astropro Altitude. It starts working in 30 minutes, while Flonase takes hours, so you can Astropro and go.
This ship would be sold to India in 2004, refurbished, and continues to be in service with the Indian Navy as the INS Vikramaditya. And this is where we get at last, the Admiral Kuznetsov class, and the ship which would be the flagship of the entire class, named, well, Admiral Kuznetsov. Planned to be a 2-ship fleet, only one was built thanks to the end of the Cold War and the Russian economy tanking. It might be smaller than a supercarrier, but it still packs a formidable punch and is well worth the title of aircraft-carrying heavy cruiser. Its primary armament is the Sukhoi Su-33, the carrier variant of the Su-27. Developed to replace the VTOL-capable Yak-38, the Su-33 featured an upgrade in range and payload, which forced the Soviet Union to ditch the VTOL concept entirely and build the larger Kuznetsov-class ships in the first place. It only carries a fraction of the aircraft of a U.S. carrier, but with 18 Su-33s on board, it's still a formidable weapon against lower-tier regional naval powers. However, the Kuznetsov isn't large enough to field an AWACS platform, which is where the 6-ship flight of MiG-29Ks come into play. Theoretically, the MiG-29s would have been able to network together with other aircraft and provide an airborne early warning and air control system, but that capability never truly materialized. Instead, the 6 MiG-29s were part of an incomplete order, which was meant to replace the entire Su-33 complement aboard the Kuznetsov. This leaves the Kuznetsov with a glaring vulnerability, as a surface action group without AWACS in the sky is just begging to be sent to the bottom of the sea. This is why aircraft carriers are so critical to modern blue water naval operations, and why, despite having more holes in the water, China remains unable to challenge the U.S. far from its own shores. For a ship designed to fight close to home, though, this isn't a big vulnerability. But it does mean that the Kuznetsov is basically a liability in any conflict that doesn't take place under cover of shore-based air defenses or against a relatively unsophisticated foe. However, the Kuznetsov packs one hell of a punch with its 12 Granite anti-ship missiles. These supersonic missiles pack a 1,600-pound warhead that can sniff out American carriers at a range of 388 miles. The missiles are so physically large and move so fast that even a direct hit from a Sea Whiz system isn't guaranteed to stop the carnage, as the supersonic wreck of the missile slams into a ship's structure with deadly kinetic energy. Considering the U.S. fleet was and still is largely fielding anti-ship missiles with a third of the explosives, the Granite continues to give sailors headaches to this day. But the Kuznetsov was almost never a part of the Soviet fleet at all. The ship was laid down in 1982 at the Nikolaev South shipyard inside of Ukraine. When Ukraine and the Soviets went on the splits, Ukrainian President Leonid Kravchuk sent a telegram to the ship's commander politely informing him that his aircraft carrier now belonged to an independent Ukraine. The captain was promptly ordered to sail to Vidyayevo before the Ukrainians could get their hands on it, ensuring it would have every opportunity to waste billions of Russian rubles in the years to come. In 1995, the Kuznetsov had its first deployment, and immediately the warning signs of what would be called Russia's cursed ship were on full display. From December 23, 1995 to March 22, 1996, the Kuznetsov and its escorts underwent a familiarization deployment into the Mediterranean, from whose warm waters the ship could operate nearly around the clock. The ship ran flight operations from early morning until 9 p.m. each day, flying aircraft close enough to the Israeli coast that the nation scrambled F-16s to escort the Russian fighters. Everything went well enough until the ship's evaporators began to break down. Responsible for creating drinking water for the crew by distilling seawater, the breakdown caused a severe water shortage amongst the crew. Sent for repairs, the ship would suffer the fate of much of the Russian Navy, as major financial problems caused severe cutbacks in the defense budget. The ship's fate was in fact as frozen as the Northern Fleet shipyard it lay moored in, with repairs being halted due to no funding being available. It wouldn't be until 1998 that the ship's overhaul was complete and she was cleared for service once more. However, aircraft carriers, or aircraft carrying heavy cruisers, aren't cheap to operate. The U.S. spends $1.5 million a day per aircraft carrier in operational costs. Thus, the Kuznetsov was stuck in port for a further 2 years, finally cleared for deployment in the Mediterranean in 2000. However, the sinking of the Kursk, a Russian-powered nuclear submarine, canceled any plans for deployment. Famously caused by a lack of maintenance and poor training, the sinking of the Kursk was an alarm bell for a long-neglected Russian fleet. In the wake of the tragedy, Russian admirals called for more funding, warning of future possible disasters. But budgets were tight, and the Russian Navy was a low priority. The Kuznetsov would assist in recovery of the Kursk before having future deployments once more canceled. As the world would come to see, this was probably a good thing, as soon serving aboard the Kuznetsov would be one of the deadliest jobs in the Russian Navy. In 2004, the carriers went out to sea for sea trials and inspection, showing worrying signs of poor maintenance. Nonetheless, she was cleared for operation, and in 2004 she partook in a large exercise in the Atlantic. In 2005, she would claim her first victim and highlight a crippling deficiency that would claim aircraft for over a decade to come. In 2005, the Kuznetsov was undergoing training in the North Atlantic when a Su-33, piloted by Sub-Colonel Yuri Korneev, came in for a landing. According to the Russian government, the plane's brakes failed, causing it to skid along the runway and crash into the ocean. Luckily, the pilot was able to eject and was safely recovered, with the Russian government later dropping depth charges in the wreckage of the plane 3,000 meters below, and then sending a submersible to ensure the plane was properly destroyed. However, soon sources came forward to counter the official government story. According to these sources, as the Su-33 came in for a landing, the arresting cable responsible for safely slowing the plane down broke. The Su-33 was thus sent sliding across the deck and over the edge. For a Russian government so focused on public perception, it would be easier to blame the airplane rather than one of the most fundamental systems of an aircraft carrier. However, whatever the truth is, further training flights were canceled as the Kuznetsov once more sailed for home. In 2006, the Kuznetsov was slated to return to service after modernization efforts to correct fundamental issues with the ship's systems. But it wouldn't be until December 2007 that the Kuznetsov was once more sent on deployment. Here, the Kuznetsov would enter a sort of grace period, where everything largely worked as it should. However, a lack of proper maintenance by a cash-strapped Russia, determined to prove it was a legitimate naval power, would lead to disaster. In 2009, a short in a wire caused a fire which would kill one crew member. Later that year, the ship caused an international incident. On February 14, 2009, a European Maritime Safety Agency's Clean Sea Net satellite alerted to a detected oil spill just off the southern coast of Ireland. An Irish Air Corps patrol aircraft was dispatched, visually confirming the spill surrounding the Admiral Kuznetsov and its underway replenishment ships. Coincidentally, the Kuznetsov was undergoing refueling at the time, but the Russians immediately denied that anything had happened. The British, meanwhile, estimated about 300 tons of oil had been spilled. The Russians admitted culpability, though claimed only 20 to 30 tons of oil had been spilled, while either washing the ship's decks or pumping out the bilges. Consider those numbers. The Russians were apparently greasing their entire flight deck with oil an inch thick to cause a massive spill. Of course, it wasn't 20 to 30 tons, but rather 300 tons over an area 4 miles by 5 miles. 2 days later, the Russians confirmed they'd been undergoing refueling when the spill happened, but did not know how or why it had occurred. Given that the Kuznetsov was at this point being escorted by one tugboat in case it broke down, the cause of the spill was pretty obvious. 10 days later, the Russians would admit fault and claimed that human error and technical malfunction had been to blame, with what technical malfunction that was exactly remaining a mystery. In 2011, the Kuznetsov was sent to menace the world's oceans once more, in a deployment lasting until February, when it departed Syria for its home port, and promptly lost all propulsion. Despite a year of repairs after the oil spill incident, the Russian fleet had such little faith in the Kuznetsov that it once more had been deployed with an accompanying tugboat. That proved prudent, as the Nikolai Chikar would take the mighty Russian's fleet flagship in tow and slowly drag it back home. She would have one more successful deployment under her own power, until she was once more deployed in 2016 off the coast of Syria to support Russian military operations, bombing civilians because military targets are too hard to accurately hit. Once more, she was accompanied by an ocean-going tug, which probably really filled her small surface action group with great confidence in the Russian flagship's ability to survive combat. The ship Su-33 had been fitted with bomb sights to allow the use of free-fall bombs with limited accuracy, allowing the carrier's planes to carry out ground attack missions inside Syria. By now, the Kuznetsov was famously belching out huge clouds of black smoke as she steamed along, and on October 21st, she passed through the English Channel. The British Royal Navy dispatched 2 ships to escort the largest Russian naval deployment since the Cold War. On November 14th, 2016, a MiG-29 took off from the carrier on a routine exercise, only to be put into a holding pattern when the crew realized that one of the arresting cables had once more broken. Rather than be diverted to a nearby airbase, the ship's captain ordered the pilot to stay in the air. Inevitably, the MiG-29 ran out of fuel and was forced to ditch into the sea, with the pilot being rescued via helicopter. The incident highlighted not just the gross incompetence of the ship's captain, which cost the Russian Navy an $11 million jet, but also the disrepair of the ship itself, as well as its greatest design flaw. Because the ship had basically been designed to be a carrier light, it utilized a ski ramp to aid planes in taking off. However, ski ramps severely limit the fuel and ordnance of a carrier aircraft, as well as the type of aircraft the ship can deploy. On a full-sized carrier, or one with more powerful launch facilities, or even planes with more powerful engines, the MiG-29 would have likely had enough fuel that when it became obvious the arresting cable wasn't being fixed, it could have still made for a friendly airfield. But that's just not the Russian way. And despite the arresting cable historically snapping in two, the captain ordered the plane to stay in the air until it ran out of fuel. The Kuznetsov continued combat operations, with the Russians claiming major victories in airstrikes against Islamic State terror groups. Given that the ship was already suffering from a severe shortage of qualified pilots and the imprecision of Russian precision weapons, these claims remain dubious. However, on the 3rd of December, half a month after its first arresting gear failure, the Kuznetsov struck again, destroying another Su-33 as its arresting gear failed once more. The Su-33 slid straight into the drink, and the pilot was forced to eject. At this point, the Kuznetsov had downed more Russian aviators and inflicted a greater financial cost to Russia than the Islamic State had, and it was decided that the rest of the air power on the ship would be transferred to airfields to continue combat operations, to what we can only imagine was the great relief of the entire crew. Field repairs were carried out until Russia ceased the involvement of the Kuznetsov's battle group in the region and dispatched it for home. Now safely in port at the 35th Ship Repair Plant in Minsk, the Kuznetsov would lose its appetite for Russian planes and develop a new one for Russian lives. In what could only be described as a comedy of errors, the Kuznetsov took on the job of single-handedly destroying as much of the Russian defense budget as it possibly could. The ship needed serious repairs, but whether it was the vodka or completely unfounded Russian optimism, the Kuznetsov began a modernization program to extend its service life by 25 years. Huge combat ships are expected to have service lives that extend into the decades. After all, U.S. carriers can serve for half a century without major maintenance. But U.S. carriers also generally just work. The Kuznetsov did not only not work, it was fundamentally flawed with an aircraft arresting system that saw systemic breakdowns and also had no role in the modern cash-strapped Russian military. The Kuznetsov was a bad ship with no mission, but it was a prestige item for Vladimir Putin's Russia. So, in typical Russian fashion, Russia doubled down on an absolutely terrible investment, because sunk cost fallacy is apparently not taught there. The Kuznetsov needed serious upgrades to its superstructure, electronic components, arresting gear, crew facilities, engines, everything. The ship was moved to the PD-50 floating dock, one of the largest floating docks in the world. This was very much a case of Freddy meets Jason, as PD-50 had its own colorful history. It was built in 1978 for the Soviet Union by Sweden, and at the time would be the world's largest floating dock. However, during sea trials, 2 of its ballast water tanks collapsed and threatened to sink the dock, prompting the Swedes to quickly tow it back to shore. Repairs were made and PD-50 was handed over to the Soviets. The Soviets took PD-50 in tow using 2 Dutch tugboats. However, after sailing past the Norwegian coast, PD-50 attempted to defect to NATO and made a break for freedom, breaking free of its tugs. Unfortunately, its quest for sweet, sweet capitalist freedom was ended when storm winds blew the dock ashore on the Soviet side of the Norwegian border. Damage to the dock was extensive but ultimately deemed repairable. Thus, the dock was shipped to a Norwegian shipyard where 4,000 tons of steel were used in its reconstruction. The accident-prone PD-50 would cross paths with Kuznetsov in 2018 when it had enough of living under Russian yoke and decided to permanently quit the chat, and it would try to take the Kuznetsov with it. PD-50 suddenly began to sink, causing the Kuznetsov to sink with it, and one of the dock's 70-ton cranes to come smashing down onto the Kuznetsov's flight deck. The accident left a massive 200-square-foot hole that would cost 70 million rubles to fix. The crane itself would take until the end of 2018 to be removed, slowing down the...
They said that since I worked full-time, I wouldn't be able to go to school. But with WGU, I was able to do my classes on my own time and take all my tests online when it suited me best. Learn more at WGU.edu.
Repair efforts even further. The Kuznetsov was at least floating, though, and repairs continued on board the ship. In late May 2019, it was decided that 2 dry docks would be merged to make room for the Kuznetsov and other large surface vessels of the Russian Navy. Though this would take a year and a half of construction efforts. Out of dry dock, most of the necessary repairs and upgrades for the Kuznetsov could not be carried out, pushing its expected completion date back years. To make matters worse, the ship caught fire in December of 2019, killing 2 and injuring over a dozen. Damage to the ship was estimated at $8 million. In May 2022, though, the finish line was in sight, and the ship was being prepared for removal from dry dock. That's when the world's most flammable ship went up in flames again, with Russian state news agencies claiming the fire was promptly put out and the ship's damage control system had done its job with no damage. The Kuznetsov would make its triumphant and murderous exit out of dry dock in February 2023. However, the ship is estimated to still need about a year of overhauls before it is combat-worthy once more. And combat-worthy is a term we're using about as loosely here as the Russian Navy. It'd be more accurate to say that it'll be about a year before the Kuznetsov is ready to return to the task of generally doing more to hurt the enemy than its own crew and the Russian budget. Generally, but not completely. A woman weeps at the coffin of her dead son, Alexei. She lost him alive just a few weeks before when he was recruited to serve in Ukraine. He had no combat experience whatsoever. After merely a few days of training, he joined the Semyonovsky regiment on the front line. 2 weeks later, his mother was told he died heroically for his country. Alexei's story is a true one, and just one of the problems plaguing Russia's military right now. Poor training, dare we say criminally inadequate training, is one reason Russia's military is failing right now. It's the prominent reason why young men like Alexei are getting to the battlefield and thinking out loud, I don't know what to do. It's why some men don't want to be there. At times, the proverbial blind have led the blind. Suffice it to say, the effect on troop morale has been devastating. We'll talk about declining morale in depth soon. First, we want to discuss hardware issues. Russia has a lot of them, and Ukraine has a lot of help in the hardware department. The aid parade for Ukraine has become an ever-expanding phenomenon. In terms of military spending, Russia is one of the highest spending countries in the world. In 2021, it placed 5th on the list of the highest defense budgets behind the UK, India, China, and the US. The amount of money it spent was reported to be $65.9 billion. The US was a whopping $800.7 billion. Things have changed somewhat since those budgets were planned. Reuters reported in September 2022 that Russia plans to spend $600 billion on defense and security by 2025. How can Russia even afford that? Over in the U.S., it was reported in June that a Senate Armed Services Committee voted to approve military spending of $858 billion for 2023. The Defense Secretary in the UK has also said that the country, in spite of current economic woes and now pervasive food banks, will dramatically increase its military spending. In terms of percentage of its GDP, Russia spends more on defense than the other top spenders, although the U.S. isn't too far behind. For 2021, Ukraine spent around $5 billion on defense, which was more of its GDP than Russia, the U.S., and the UK spent in relation to their GDP. Even so, Russia will soon be spending a ton of money. It's people's money, money it doesn't have. This will be problematic. As a British journalist said recently, Russia can't afford Putin's war in Ukraine. Money, or lack thereof, is a major issue for Russia, especially as the time goes on. And notice how the journalist called it Putin's war, not Russia's war. The emphasis on Putin is very important. It isn't the first time that Russia is straining its finances to retain some political authority in the world. The country was economically unstable since the end of the Cold War. Vladimir Putin, who would soon be on good terms with the U.S., only came to power because he unofficially agreed not to go after the oligarchs, who took advantage of the chaos that came after the collapse of the Soviet Union. That was okay with the West. Just to give you an example of what we mean, 22 years ago when Putin was Russia's acting president, he was described in the New York Times Magazine with the words utterly professional, a star, sensitive, a man we can do business with, a liberal, humane, and decent European. Meanwhile, the Russian people watched on as their country was being pillaged. Many discerning people distrusted Putin, as well as the Western capitalists. This is important to understand for the show today. The Russian public does not want to suffer like that again. Many of them are not supportive of another costly war, even if they do hate the West. This is one of Russia's fundamental problems with this war. A lot of Russians have become skeptical over their country's leadership and the expensive shenanigans it gets up to, and widespread public skepticism is never a good thing for a war effort. Sure, Putin's approval rating has gone from 67% to 77% over the last year, but as more body bags containing sons return to their mothers, we might see more support for the West and less support for the perfidious Putin. The U.S. and Putin know very well what happens when a country stretches itself too thin where cash is involved. With the Ukraine situation, the U.S. and UK might just be biding their time while bringing economically struggling Russia to its already scuffed knees. This is partly the reason why the U.S. has spent at least $54 billion on aid to Ukraine. It's why some Democratic and Republican politicians want to spend much more. Money matters a lot in this world, and Ukraine has no shortage of very rich countries happy to bankroll the excessively pricey conflict. The numbers keep changing, but some sources say the U.S. has already spent about $25 billion in military aid alone, with the rest being humanitarian aid and other kinds of help. The UK comes next with a military-only aid package of just over $4 billion. Next is Poland, $1.8 billion, then Germany at $1.2 billion, and Canada at $1.03 billion. As we said, the numbers are changing all the time since new packages keep getting approved. For instance, bipartisan legislators in the U.S. recently introduced a bill to give the Pentagon emergency powers to sell as many weapons as it wants to Ukraine. The 50-odd countries that are sending aid to Ukraine are collectively spending over $100 billion, although it should be said that some countries are sending warm gloves and toothbrushes, while others are sending very expensive modern weapons. Meanwhile, Russia's military aid from around the globe adds up to something close to the value of a brass button. Russia isn't getting financial aid. Although it's said Belarus is offering non-economic aid, and there are tens of thousands of mercenaries fighting for Russia, still, judging economic aid for Russia and Ukraine is like comparing Mount Everest to a mouse. As for China, the alliance of the U.S. with some Asian nations might be enough to make China concerned, but so far it hasn't openly offered support for Russia's war effort. Even those who say the conflict is a U.S. proxy war have condemned Russia. We are trying to say that Russia isn't going to get any considerable help anytime soon, and help for Ukraine is seemingly bottomless. Right now, things are looking like one of of those us versus rest of the world soccer matches. It's like the old movie Escape to Victory, when the evil Nazi guards and the mixed nationality POW guys played a soccer game. And guess who wins? So one of Russia's biggest problems is the fact that it's fighting a war alone against a country that's supported on almost a global scale. This cannot be underestimated. Sure, the US and the UK aren't officially sending soldiers to fight on the front lines, even if some of the citizens in those countries would like that. Instead, what they're sending in aid is indispensable to Ukraine's war effort. In June, it was reported that the UK just sent over 6,500 shoulder-mounted anti-air armor weapons and Javelin anti-tank missiles to Ukraine. It sent hundreds of millions of dollars of what the press just called lethal weapons. Some of the packages included M109 howitzers, anti-tank weapons, multiple launch rocket systems, and hundreds of air defense missiles. As for the U.S., it's raining lethal weapons down on Ukraine, reminiscent of a biblical flood. It's like a supermarket sweep for Ukraine, but with weapons instead of groceries. The U.S. has also sent scores of Javelin anti-tank missiles, as well as billions of dollars in Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, helicopters, counter-artillery, Humvees, electronic warfare detection systems, AIM-777 howitzers, armored personnel carriers, light anti-armor weapons, AT-4 anti-armor systems, and the list goes on and on. You might be wondering how this has affected Russia's war effort. The answer is in a big way. If you've been following what's going on, you'll know that the Ukraine advance later in the year pushed the Russians out of the strongholds. Towns are liberated, only for the liberated to find mass graves, and what the Western media referred to as a giant scrap heap of Russian tanks. You'll notice in the list of lethal weapons we just talked about, many of the tools the West provided can be very effective at taking out tanks. After the Russians had retreated from those strongholds, after months of being there and wreaking havoc on the locals, masses of tanks were left. Sometimes with the burned bodies of young Russian soldiers inside them. In part thanks to all that aid, Ukraine has been kicking the living daylights out of Russian tanks. And we aren't just talking about the older tanks, the T-62s and T-72s, but some of the newer T-90s. Russia has always been a leading nation when it came to tank tech, but right now, its tank strategy sucks. So let's just say for now that many young Russian soldiers are not too keen on getting into one of those tanks. The chances of being incinerated are high, all for a war they might not properly understand and don't want to be a part of. If Ukraine wasn't being held, the conflict would turn out very differently. You already know Ukraine doesn't have a massive military budget. It has only 200,000 active personnel compared to Russia's 850,000 active personnel. Ukraine only has about 2,500 tanks of its own, although it has lost some recently too. Russia has about 12,000 tanks, even though it's been losing about 10 a day since Ukraine advanced. So make no mistake, all that aid is considerably helping Ukraine. But the problem for Russia isn't just about machines. Its tactics have been less than brilliant. Its support of troops has been lacking at times. For instance, Russian tanks should have the requisite modern armor to defend themselves, but that's often not what happened. Russian tank crews have complained that they've been ordered to advance at times when there hasn't been adequate reconnaissance. That is insane. But worse, the tanks are often out in the open, not moving with sufficient infantry and artillery. You don't have to be a military genius to know that shouldn't happen. Even after playing your first game of Risk, you'll understand that. When these tanks are left so vulnerable, all those Ukrainian anti-tank weapons do their worst. At times, Russian tanks have been sitting ducks and fired upon from close range by all those javelins and new generation light anti-tank weapons that the UK and the US have been so kind to send over. As the BBC reported, US-supplied anti-tank weapons have been among the most effective weapons in Ukraine's arsenal. Since these weapons aim for the top of the tanks where they're the weakest, they result in something called pop-tops. That means when the turret is blown off, it almost always means the 3 men inside die. It's an awful way to go, we expect. So how do you think Russian soldiers feel about this? The Russians have lost tanks en masse, maybe about 2,500, and a good portion of them have been abandoned. Their crews just got out and ran for their lives. Some soldiers have said they'll never return to the front line. What they saw there was a strategic blunder after strategic blunder. They felt way too vulnerable, as though they were being sent to their deaths. It wasn't a fight at all, it was an annihilation. One of the Russian soldiers later said, "We were like blind kittens, shocked by our armor. It wouldn't cost much to equip us." Some of the tanks didn't have proper armor. Tanks should have explosive reactive armor or active armor, but reports state that some Russian tank crews had taken to covering their turrets with wood or with iron cages they found. They were doing tank DIY, which might sound funny if you've never heard the screams of your friends being burned alive. Remember we talked about Russia being financially stretched? Is that affecting how well these tanks are performing? Analysts have been scratching their heads at the heavy losses of Russian tanks. They say those tanks should have the right armor to protect against these types of attacks. And even though anti-tank weapons can still be catastrophic to an armored machine, they shouldn't have been going down as fast as they have. Analysts have said it's been a problem with maintenance of the armor, or perhaps the absence of armor, or the tank crews not being trained in ERA systems. Experts are saying that Russian tank armor is proving to be about 8 times less effective than the tank armor that NATO uses. This could be a matter of money, lack of expertise, a lack of good leadership, or all those things combined. This dubious doctrine has often led to tanks grouping together, forming a great big sitting duck traffic jam. At times, the tank crews have been moving without any support, and when they have support, it's often from guys who are flipping burgers or fixing someone's plumbing not a few weeks earlier. Low morale is the reason many Russians don't want to fight. It's why some have abandoned their tanks or their posts pretty quickly. One Russian soldier said he was among 78 guys in his brigade that refused orders and said they would fight no more. He told a journalist, "I'm morally exhausted. There's absolutely no trust in the authorities and the higher command. I'm tired, homesick. My daughter was born 3 months ago." Another said, "I thought a long time about it and came to the decision. I understood that I had to refuse so I could stay alive. There are so many reports saying the same things." And let's not forget that due to the retreat of Russian troops, when Ukraine advanced and took back thousands of square miles from the Russians, what was left behind was often something of military value. Ukrainian ammo, for instance, can often be used with captured Russian tanks. There's also the question of centralization. Chechens have been fighting for the Russian army, as has the National Guard, as have soldiers hired by private contractors, plus mercenaries, and with this comes the fact that they're fighting without a centralized structure. An analyst said this about that: "There are multiple strands of the Russian army with their own agendas, tactics, and reasons for fighting. There have been reports of Russian draft officers approaching guys in the street and signing them up for fighting. The press called aggressive recruitment. One guy said he worked in IT and should have been exempted from the draft, but to his utter astonishment, he later found himself saying farewell to his wife and 4-year-old kid and heading to the front. He did not want to fight. He did not know how to fight. Men like him have been getting just 5 to 10 days of basic training and a further 5 to 15 days of unit training, and then they're packed off to the battlefield. To say this is not good would be as obvious as saying you should not enter your cat into a swimming competition with dogs. You guys and girls watching this who are old enough for a military draft, how do you think you'd fare in that amount of training? How do you think you'd deal with hearing your buddies being incinerated in a tank by weapons you know have been sent to your enemy by numerous nations? Do you think you could cope? Many Russians can't, and that's why there are reports coming in from all over about Russian men taking devastating and drastic actions to not fight. We can't say what they did exactly, but we imagine you can guess. As for Alexei, as you know, he had just a few days of training. He went to the front line without knowing the first thing about combat. If you asked him about land warfare strategy or tank armor, he might have looked at you like you'd asked him what he thinks about string theory. Russia has not been very open about sending guys like Alexei into the bloody battle. A journalist for RT said this was plain wrong. She wrote, "Military leaders, now is not the time to lie. You have no right to lie, and now it is a crime." Alexei's father simply said, "My son has died. What am I for?" This kind of outside criticism is not good for the Russian war effort. It should be said that Alexei wasn't forced to fight. He just did what was asked of him. A Russian lawyer familiar with the case said he didn't try to get out of the service. He gathered his things together and he went. He acted bravely. He was brave, for sure. But if you were able to go back in time and ask that drunkard of a philosopher Socrates what he thought about this, he'd tell you that there's a fine line between bravery and ignorance. Alexei and other men like him shouldn't be fighting in a war after so little training. Russia is not Sparta. Most men know nothing about mortal combat. As has happened in the history around the world, Russia has offered some prisoners early release or immediate release if they fight. But are prisoners your best option? Often men become prisoners from a lack of self-control. Perhaps a childhood of trauma has led to their frontal lobes not kicking in when they get mad. This is the last thing you want in a war. History tells us convicts don't usually make the best soldiers. You don't want lunatics fighting for you. Anyway, some prisoners might not be too fond of the state that locked them up. Do you think they'd risk their lives for it? And if some rather violent psychopaths ended up in control of Ukrainian towns and their citizens, what do you think they might do with total impunity to kill? Psychos don't win wars. All-out enraged assaults don't win fights. Strategy and emotional control do. Not only that, but many of the best trained men are dead, and they'll be hard to replace. In September, the BBC reported that 1,000 Russian officers had succumbed. It was BBC Russia, so we had to translate, but here's how the article started. The BBC, based on open sources, managed to identify more than 6,020 Russian soldiers who died in the war in Ukraine. Particularly sensitive losses were suffered by Special Forces units as well as junior officers. It will not be easy to make up for their lack in a Russian army. Russia's soldiers, the ones properly trained with combat experience, are educated in what Russia is an expert at. That is short-lasting, hyper-intensive combat. The Russian military was virtually designed for this, and this war is anything but that. While Ukraine has been getting ready for long-term warfare for close to a decade, Russia might well be playing the long game here, but there's no doubt that it has done badly recently, and morale, for the most part, is about as high as Hades after an earthquake. Nonetheless, as bad as things have looked as of late, Russia is still a military powerhouse for a reason. It's made some mistakes, sure. Some of its troops have watched them and are not impressed, but by the time this show comes out, maybe Russia will have improved matters. Despite these losses, we should not underestimate the Russian military. This pretty much contradicts what you've heard today, but the failures of the Russian military we've discussed have happened. The support we've told you Ukraine has is very much real. Okay, so what's behind Russia's underperformance besides what we've discussed? The same analyst we just quoted said Russia's massive weapons arsenal is from several generations, and that might make it quite inflexible. The more losses Russia faces, the more equipment comes out of storage warehouses, and so on the whole, you have more technical inflexibility. When you add it all up, and we haven't even gone into the corruption of the Russian military and the present lack of exceptional leadership, things are not looking good for Russia. The number of young folks that are willing to fight is getting smaller, and the number of troops in the field is diminishing. They are outnumbered and outmoraled. We know that's not the word. The public might soon turn on Putin, especially when military spending increases. We just hope when the last straw that breaks the camel's back is dropped, no one makes a grab for the nuclear launch codes. Things are looking grim for old Vladimir Putin as the Ukraine war spirals out of control. His troops are being routed, and devastating sanctions continue to ruin Russia's economy. His response has been to escalate further, shelling Ukrainian civilians indiscriminately and threatening the use of nuclear weapons. He's even ordered a partial mobilization of Russian troops, a mass draft that looks to send hundreds of thousands of troops into harm's way with little training and subpar weapons. Surely he won't have the public support to win the next election with this kind of performance. Yeah, not so much, because while Vladimir Putin is technically elected democratically, his regime is anything but free and fair. Elections in Russia tend to be a preordained affair, with Putin's party winning overwhelmingly and opposition leaders frequently being arrested or disqualified by the government. The one time Putin left office since becoming president in the early 2000s was due to term limits, and he set up his second-in-command Dmitry Medvedev to take his place while he took the number 2 seat. Medvedev then changed the law to remove the term limits, and Putin was right back in 2 years later. So Putin clearly isn't going away anytime soon. The most recent Russian legislative elections in 2021 saw Putin running under the independent line, which only represents his personal political brand, win over 3/4 of the vote, with the only other candidates getting more than 2% of the votes being the remnants of the old Communist Party and the eccentric fascist party led by longtime Russian crack candidate Vladimir Zhirinovsky. All major reform parties barely charted, and most had been outlawed or otherwise restricted. And the opposition often has more to worry about than just being banned from running. Most famously, global anti-corruption activist Alexei Navalny was penalized by Russia on trumped-up charges, then poisoned by Putin while abroad, and then sentenced to prison in Russia for failing to appear in court on time while he was in the hospital. Even more of an escalation, Putin's allies in Belarus forced an Irish plane carrying a Belarusian opposition leader to land under false pretenses, and then arrested their target while he was on another country's plane. It's clear that Putin's intention is to make the price of opposition far too high for anyone to be willing to pay. And that's what the other guys thought too. Russia has had a long history of taking care of business when the leader is deeply unpopular and not receptive to change. Most famously, Tsar Nicholas II saw himself deposed, later murdered by revolutionary forces, leading to the rise of the Soviet Union. And over half a century later, the last Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, saw his empire undone by mass protests that led to the toppling of the Berlin Wall, and was then overthrown by hardline communist forces, who were then promptly overthrown by democratic forces. Is the same about to happen to Putin? If Putin is removed from power, it won't be through elections, as he's quickly consolidated the power of the ballot box. But it wasn't elections that did in the Tsar or Gorbachev. And there's one thing Putin can't account for, the power of the people. Russians were largely in favor of the Ukraine war at first, as Putin boasted of restoring the glory of the Russian Empire. Then their tanks and ships started being blown up. The sanctions cut them off from the rest of the world, and platoon after platoon of Russian men wound up coming home in coffins. The situation was bad enough, and then the draft started, with reports of it being concentrated in ethnic minority areas that Putin was happy to turn into cannon fodder. And soon enough, people filled the streets. Protests were taking place as soon as the war began, and they were met with strong opposition from the government. Those who participated were quickly arrested, often charged with serious crimes like sedition, and new laws were passed banning anti-war statements. Even those who simply signed petitions have been pardoned. It sent the anti-war movement underground for a long time, but with the introduction of the mobilization and conscription, many feel like they have nothing to lose. Within a day of the mobilization announcement on September 21st, new protests had broken out in the streets, and over 2,000 people were quickly arrested. But the protests are only growing. Most dramatically, on September 25th, a group of women in the Sakha Republic held a major rally chanting, "We will not give up our husbands." Sure enough, the Russian police in the Siberian region soon dispersed the protest, but with less force than they usually do. Maybe they were worried about the bad press, or maybe they had some sympathizers in the security forces. While those in Putin's enforcement agencies are very cautious about criticizing the government in any way, there have been reports of Russian soldiers disobeying orders, trying to surrender to the Ukrainians, or fleeing to other countries. But the biggest challenge to Putin might come from within. Putin is not accountable to anyone, and that's a problem. He's had 20 years to build his network of support, and he's not taking any chances. He's notoriously insular, only surrounds himself with loyalists, and won't even let them get close to him. He is known for sitting over 10 feet away from anyone else in meetings, which likely results in a lot of yelling. But as things deteriorate, it's not clear if even that will save him. After all, it was Hitler's elite military officers, like Klaus von Stauffenberg and Erwin Rommel, who eventually plotted to kill him as the war spun out of control. And it might be getting out of control awfully fast. Putin has relied on his military team to deliver victory, and is quick to relieve people of their duty if they disappoint him. That was what happened to Sergei Shoigu, a general and minister of defense who was one of Putin's most trusted allies since 2012. An ethnic Tuvan from Siberia, he was seen as a pragmatic leader who was a shrewd military mind. But as the war went on, his tactics seemed to be less methodical for Putin. Militants within the administration wanted Shoigu removed, and his replacement would be even more militant.
Speak
Another
quickly
warrior
and
from an
well.
unleader background,
Speak ill or slowly, and I may
Kadyrov,
feed
is the
your
leader
tongue
of
to
the
the
Chechen
dogs.
Republic, a Muslim region where Putin brutally put down secession movements in the last decade. Known for his
dislike
persecution of his own
Welcome.
people, particularly
Speak.
women and gay residents,
on.
Kadyrov
Do not
became
waste time,
infamous for
Petters.
his brutality during the Ukraine war,
What?
which only
He-
led Putin to promote him. While Shoigu called for focusing on consolidating Russia's